Thank you, Laurentina, and all the other co-sponsors for making these webinars and the conference possible. As Laurentina noted, I am the president and secretary of this group in the United States called the National Link Coalition. We are the national resource on this link between animal abuse and human violence. There's our email address, our website. Please go to our website. There is a tremendous amount of information there in many languages. I'll explain more about the coalition in a minute. Laurentina was absolutely correct when she said that we can save more lives by looking at the link between animals and people. And that's the goal of our program, by getting agencies to working together as teams. And I will explain this in the American context and hope that we can adapt this to use in Portugal using Portuguese systems in place. Claudio was absolutely correct by saying we need to connect crimes against animals with crimes against people. And by embracing this link, we can make fundamental changes that benefit all of society, the vulnerable victims, whether they have 2 legs or 4 legs. National Link Coalition was founded in 2008 by 25 of us who had been working in this area for many years independently. And we came together, and today we have 5,100 people in 55 countries and all across the United States who get our free monthly newsletter. It's called the Link Letter. And if you would like to also receive it, just send us an email and we will add you to our list. We work in 4 main areas. We showcase wonderful programs that are going on, not only in the US, but around the world. We look at laws, public policy, legislation. We build public and professional awareness through training programs such as this. And we back it up with academic research. We follow an increasing number of academic publications that are documenting the link between animal abuse and human violence. We have over 2,100 references in our bibliography to show that this is legitimate, and there's academic evidence backing this all up. And we try to create local coalitions and national coalitions around the world. We have coalitions in Canada, the United Kingdom, Spain, Italy, Sweden, and I'm hoping to see a coalition in Portugal as a result of all this work that we are all doing together here. It's a very exciting time. The link is a warning. It's a red flag. It's a sign that when animals are abused, people are at risk. And when people are abused, animals are at risk. They go hand in hand, or hand in paw, if you will. The history of animal protection has often been that it is treated in isolation. It's treated as a separate issue because people think that animals are not as important as people. Animal protection is on the margins of law enforcement. It's on the margins of legislative activity. It's on the margins of social services work. The fact is they are all connected, and any type of family violence affects the other types of family violence. Animal cruelty is a potential indicator and a potential predictor of violence and of other crimes against people and society. I emphasize the word potential because it does not always mean that somebody who harms animals will harm people. Every little boy who kicks a cat is not going to grow up to become a serial killer, but many of them do. But if we look at animal cruelty as a potential warning sign, it opens up a whole window into the lives of these people and their environment and the potential crimes and other issues that are going on around them. We live in a world of what I call silos. People in professional groups just work in their own field, and they often don't communicate with each other. They don't exchange ideas because they're so busy with what they have to do. It often doesn't occur to them that there may be links with other related fields. And when we think of family violence, it actually encompasses four types of violence. There's child abuse and neglect, there's domestic violence, there's elder abuse, and there's animal cruelty. And of these four fields, animal cruelty has always been excluded from human services because people think it's only an animal. And so law enforcement, the court system, social services, legislators have always pushed animal cruelty aside because they don't think animals are as important as people. And so this is the model that has been in place for hundreds of years. It wasn't even until the early 1990s that the human services agencies began to recognize that their areas had connections, that they had links. The first national conference in the US on the impact of domestic violence on children wasn't held until 1992. And about the same time, elder abuse agencies began recognizing that domestic violence also affects the elderly as well as young couples. So those three agencies started talking to each other, but the animal cruelty side was still excluded. Well, the link is bringing that all together, and we throw away this model and replace it with this. And this is what the link looks like. It's a very simple diagram that shows that anybody working in any one of these four fields can see other forms of family violence. And law enforcement can be right there in the center and see all four. Veterinarians can see all four forms. Social workers can see all four forms. And so it's important for people in any of these fields to just have a basic understanding of what these four types of family violence are, what's involved, and who to report these issues to, and have those agencies investigate it and have the prosecutors prosecute it, recognizing the link, because having multiple crimes accentuates and accelerates the judicial process and makes these crimes more serious. The link connects the dots between animal abuse and other forms of family violence. Animal abuse is the tip of the iceberg, if you will. And whoever investigates animal cruelty in an area often sees child abuse, elder abuse, or domestic violence, but also other issues. There may be alcoholism, substance abuse, marital problems, financial distress, any other forms of social problems are often under the surface. The animal cruelty is often the first thing that comes to the attention of law enforcement and social service agencies, because this abuse often occurs outdoors where their neighbors can see it, and the neighbors know that the dog can't pick up the phone and dial for help. Animal abuse and animal cruelty, animal neglect, they're all part of an intergenerational cycle of violence. And the domestic violence abuser, when I'm talking about domestic violence, I'm going to assume this is a man. We do have women who abuse men. We have intimate partner violence in same-sex relationships. But for the sake of simplicity, I'll assume it's a man abusing a woman. But the abuser often harms or threatens the animal as a way to gain control and to coerce the family and to make them fear anything that would happen to the animals if they were to leave. And so the survivors stay trapped in this toxic environment. They're literally being held hostage out of fear for what will happen to their animals. The children are exposed to all this. They see the domestic violence, they see the animal abuse. This is the environment they grow up in. They come to think this is a normal way of life. And they grow up to become violent or victims themselves, and they wind up repeating the whole process. And so it's just this vicious cycle that goes around and around, and it's this intergenerational cycle of violence. we can all do a better job of protecting people and pets and saving lives by recognizing this link. Animal cruelty is a crime of violence. It's not a crime against property. It is a crime of violence. And it's not only the animal that is the victim of this crime. If we arrest animal abusers and punish them, it prevents other crimes, and it also changes the community's attitudes towards what is acceptable. It changes attitudes towards violence. If we take stronger measures to not only prevent animal cruelty, but to prosecute it and to punish it, it certainly benefits dogs and cats, and we know we call a dog man's best friend. It certainly benefits man's best friend, but it also benefits mankind. And it really benefits women. And we'll talk about this when I talk more about the link with animal abuse and domestic violence. Many people in law enforcement, unfortunately, don't treat animal abuse as a serious issue. They think they have more important things to deal with. They have much more serious crimes, and they do. They have a lot on their plate. They have a lot of terrible people that they have to work with, a lot of serious crimes. But by focusing on the link, they begin to realize that this is something that they need to take seriously. If we recognize animal abuse as an indicator that something is wrong in a household, this may be the first step in stopping the cycle of violence that leads to those other crimes as well. I'll give you an example of this. In the city of Nashville, Tennessee, in the United States, a number of years ago, they had a tremendous increase in women who were being killed in domestic violence cases. So they conducted a lethality assessment to try to determine what was putting these women at such severe risk of death. And they decided there were three factors that were the most important. And so when women called the crisis line, the telephone hotline, to report that they were being abused, they asked these women three questions. They determined that these were the three most important factors that put her at risk of dying. The three questions were, has he threatened suicide? Does he have access to a weapon? And has he threatened to hurt or kill the pets? If she answered yes to any of those three questions, they had a special intervention that they put into place. I don't know the details of that, what that intervention was, but they realized that this was a triage situation, and these three questions made this a much more serious case. At the end of a year, the number of calls coming into the hotline, into the crisis line, increased 50%. And we don't know whether there was more domestic violence or just greater awareness. We don't know why there was such an increase in the number of calls that came in. But even despite that 50% increase, the number of deaths decreased 80%. That's how significant these three factors are in saving the lives of women in domestic violence. Animal abuse is also a public health risk. There is a big movement in the United States, and probably in other countries as well, to ban certain breeds of dogs, particularly pit bulls, which are often used for dog fighting. And the fact is that an overwhelming number of people who are killed by dog bites are killed by pit bulls. But there's something else involved. A study was done looking at every dog bite fatality in the United States over a 10-year period. There were 256 people who were killed by dogs. And it turned out that while pit bulls were overrepresented among the dogs involved, a much more significant factor was that in 21% of these cases, 1/5 of these fatalities, the dog, regardless of the breed, the dog had been abused or neglected. The animals fought back against the cruelty with their teeth. That was the only weapon that they had. And it turns out that the abuse or neglect is more of a factor than the breed of the dog. These dogs are often called high-risk dogs because they are obtained by people not as companions, but to show off their status, to be macho status symbols, because they want other people to think that they are aggressive people, and so they get an aggressive dog. And another study found that these types of dogs are often part of a high-risk lifestyle. And owners of these types of dogs are much more likely to be convicted of other crimes. This study found that owners of these high-risk dogs were 3 times more likely to be convicted for domestic violence, 7 times more likely to have narcotics offenses, 9 times more likely to be child abusers, 14 times more likely to have alcohol problems. The mayor of the city of Baltimore many years ago created a task force to deal with animal cruelty issues as a public safety measure. She said, animal cruelty is more than just a legal issue. It is a community issue. If you improve animal welfare in a community, you improve public safety for everyone. It's sort of like the broken window theory in law enforcement. If you start letting people get away with things like broken windows, they feel they can get away with other things. And the same thing with animal cruelty. If people get away with animal cruelty, they figure they can get away with other crimes. So by stopping that animal cruelty, we're stopping other crimes. And a growing number of American cities have started these animal cruelty task forces to deal with these issues because there are so many cases that come to the attention of officials. I'll explain in a minute how the American system of law enforcement works because it's different than Portugal's. But in the United States, most of these laws, almost all of them, are enforced on the local level or the state level. The federal government rarely gets involved with animal cruelty. They're starting to change because of the link. But most of the work is done on the local or the state level, and we have 50 states. This started to change in 2013 when our federal Department of Justice instituted a task force to look at animal cruelty issues. And what they said was very revealing. They said animal cruelty might seem unimportant when we look at school shootings and other recent tragedies, but we know that there is a history of animal cruelty in the backgrounds of many perpetrators of violent acts. And understanding this link between animal cruelty and interpersonal violence is critical to the U.S. Department of Justice. And that was a major step forward in American law enforcement and animal protection. Shortly thereafter, we had this case. Again, this was on the federal level. Man's name was Gregory Lepsky. He was 20 years old. He and his family lived outside New York City. He had been born in the US, but the family had emigrated from Chechnya back in the 1980s, 1990s. And they were Muslim. But Gregory thought that his family had lost the strict Muslim faith because they had become Americanized. They did the typical American thing. They got a dog. And under strict Muslim thinking, dogs are considered pariahs. They're considered filthy. People do not have pet dogs in many Muslim countries. So he stabbed the dog. A member of his family called the police. They came to investigate the animal cruelty case, and they found a bomb, recruiting materials from ISIS, incriminating emails, and a plot to explode his bomb in New York City. He told police that his only regret was killing the dog because otherwise police would not have found him and he would have been able to explode his bomb in New York. Because of that case, 3 federal agencies got together. It was a counterterrorism assessment team, and they issued a report identifying animal cruelty as not only a possible warning sign for other family violence, but also a possible warning against terrorism. And they wrote that premeditated acts of animal cruelty need to be thought of as an aggression warning behavior that can be useful in identifying an increased risk of violence that should be of increased concern for law enforcement agencies. They wrote that reporting, investigating, and prosecuting animal cruelty can help minimize violent acts towards humans, including acts of terrorism. And reporting animal cruelty can assist communities and law enforcement agencies with identifying, assessing, and managing threats of planned violence while promoting public safety. This is not just an American situation. We've seen cases and issues like this all around the world. This was a study that was done in Australia. A law enforcement agency in Australia found that a history of animal abuse was a better predictor of sexual assault than were prior convictions for homicide, arsons, or firearms offenses. They found that 99% of animal cruelty offenders had committed other crimes. And they averaged 4 different crimes. They reported that law enforcement agencies would benefit from knowing about animal cruelty in the history of an offender when they profiled those offenders in homicide cases, sexual assault cases, arson cases, stalking, and child abuse. I'll show you a couple of case studies as to how this plays out in real life. This was a case from the state of Pennsylvania. It was a bitterly cold night in January, and the next door neighbors were worried about the welfare of a Great Dane dog in a homemade doghouse in the backyard in a snowy field in frigid temperatures. They called the police. The police came. They called the County Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. They took the dog away. The police went in the house and found a dead 4-year-old boy who had been beaten to death. The resident of the home was a minister. He and his wife had 7 children, 3 of their own children, 4 foster children. And 6 of the 7 children had been beaten at different times in their lives. The rest of the family escaped from Pennsylvania. They went to the state of Georgia. They were eventually apprehended. They were extradited back to Pennsylvania. He was convicted of homicide and felony child abuse, and he was sentenced to 22 years in prison. But there is more to this story. 4 years before this incident, he had been convicted of domestic violence. And 4 years before that, he had been convicted of animal cruelty. And none of the agencies in this area were talking to each other. They were in their silos. They were isolated from each other, and they never shared information. This is another case from the same area. This is from the city of Philadelphia, and I'll read it. It says, as this woman explained to the judge, she was thinking of her dogs when she pulled the trigger. For 13 years, her husband had battered her. But one night, he not only whipped her with a vacuum cleaner cord, he also punched one of her 4 German shepherds and warned her that if she left, he would find her and slit the dog's throat in front of her. Later that night, as her husband slept, she loaded a .38 caliber pistol and pointed it at herself. A moment away from suicide, she looked at one of her dogs and said, if I die, what's going to happen to the dogs? And so instead, she went into her husband's room and shot him. And she's serving a 10 to 20-year term now for murder. This shows how the animals are used to control domestic violence victims, and how the intense bonds that people have with their pets can be used against them by abusers who will exploit any weakness that they can find. Another similar case. This was from the city of Toledo in the state of Ohio. Middle-aged couple who had been fighting for years. She went off to work one day. She came back. He said, your dinner is in the oven. She went into the kitchen and found he had baked her cat to death at 500 degrees. The judge in the courtroom said, when you think they found every possible way to manipulate somebody, they come up with something new. This case is quite brutal and very unnerving. In the city of Chicago, major city in the US, you can see by this chart here, the police department looked at 332 people who had been convicted of animal cruelty. And you can see how many of them were members of gangs, had been arrested on sex crimes or firearms offenses, battery, narcotics offenses, felony charges, and multiple arrests. The animal abuser is often part of a network of other crimes. Another study found they were looking at what are the most significant risk factors for somebody becoming a domestic violence abuser. And they identified 4 primary risk factors. And the first 3 didn't surprise them. History of substance abuse, mental health issues, and low education levels. But the 4th factor that they had not expected was this history of actual or threatened abuse of an animal. It's one of the 4 greatest risk factors for somebody becoming a domestic violence abuser. Another study found that domestic violence abusers who also abuse pets use more controlling behaviors, and they're more dangerous. The domestic violence is more hands-on, it's more physical, it's more dangerous when animal abuse is also added into the dynamic. Another study in Chicago found 35% of search warrants for animal abuse or for dog fighting led to seizures of illegal narcotics or weapons. Another study found as many as 31% of teenagers in some neighborhoods in Chicago have attended a dog fight. And this case just came up last month in Hawaii. A mass shooting and a cockfight left 2 people dead and 3 people wounded. A 23-year-old man was charged with 11 counts of murder and attempted murder and firearms offenses, and similar charges were filed against a juvenile who was also involved. Dogfighting and cockfighting are especially vicious and linked with other crimes. I will give you some examples. This was a case in Florida. These cases are all recent. They've all been within the last year. A teenager who had been linked to a series of robberies was charged with killing a man's dog during an attempted robbery. The police chief called him a cold-hearted criminal. Another case, also in Florida, involved sexual abuse. He was charged with 4 counts of molesting 3 children and also for committing a sex act on a bird. He gave the children video games in return for their acceptance of his sexual acts. This was a case where the prosecutor made reference to the link when he sentenced a man to prison for killing his wife's dog. The man had been previously charged with sexual assault, and he had often said that his wife loved the dogs more than she loved him. He was caught on video killing his wife's dog, and he was sentenced to 3 years in prison, 2 years on probation, a $1,000 fine, forced to take a psychological evaluation, and prohibited from owning animals for the rest of his life. The prosecutor said, violence against an animal is often a substitute for violence against a domestic partner, a practice or a warm-up, or a coercive measure designed to instill fear. Hopefully, we have intervened before he starts acting out against humans. Many people think that animal abuse always leads to other forms of violence. That is a gross oversimplification. Many people think all serial killers started out hurting animals. That's not true. And a study a number of years ago found this to be the case. They looked at 153 people who had been convicted of animal cruelty. And they looked at their criminal records for 10 years before and 10 years afterwards to see if they had any other crimes. And they matched them with a control group of people who had not committed animal cruelty. And they expected to find that the animal abusers were more likely to have other crimes and that the animal abuse came first. People got desensitized to the violence and they moved on to hurting people. And in psychological terms, that's called the graduation hypothesis. They graduate from hurting animals to hurting people. Well, the first part proved true. They found the animal abusers were far more likely to have other criminal records. 70% of the animal abusers had other crimes. The control group, it was 22%. Still a high number, but much less than the animal abusers. But the second part did not prove true. Turned out that in the majority of cases, the other crime came first before the animal abuse. And so there are 2 ways this can go. It can be the graduation hypothesis or the escalation hypothesis, where they start out hurting animals and move on to people. But more likely, it's a pattern of general deviance. It's all part of a cluster of antisocial behaviors that include hurting people and hurting animals. So the animal abuse doesn't always lead to a link, doesn't always lead to human violence. Human violence can lead to the animal abuse. And we shouldn't be surprised when we find these links. Do children who hurt animals always grow up to become serial killers? No. Not all childhood abusers grow up to become psychopaths. And in fact, some children who are surrounded by violence seek comfort in their animals and try to protect them from other violent acts. We've identified 8 different types of links. The first is this domestic violence link. It's all about power and control. And the man tries to exert his power over the family by harming or threatening the animals. He warns her that she could be next. She stays with the children. As many as 48% of abused women say they don't leave because they're afraid of what might happen to their animals. It's a form of emotional extortion. We have a similar phenomenon with child sexual abuse, where the abuser warns the little boy or girl that if they talk, he'll strangle her puppy or his kitten. And the child now has to choose between his or her own safety and the life of his pet or her pet. And it's another form of emotional extortion. And of course, no child should have to endure all that. We have the issue of children's exposure to animal cruelty, whether they commit that act of animal cruelty or even if they witness it. And we have found that witnessing animal cruelty can be just as devastating to a child as committing an act of animal cruelty. And we have found that when a child commits an act of animal cruelty, it's one of the earliest signs of conduct disorder. And it starts showing up at about the age of 6.5. We have an issue of bullying. It's not youths who bully other children who you would think would be more aggressive towards animals, and they are. But it's youths who have been bullied. They take that anger that's been directed at them and turn it around, and they in turn abuse animals. We have the issue of animal hoarding. I'll talk about this more in a minute, but it's often linked with seniors. It can affect any age group, but tends to be older women, often living in isolation, and they collect hundreds of animals. And often, even after the animals die, they save the bodies. And when we investigate a home where there's animal hoarding going on, the first place we look is in the freezer, because they save the bodies of the dead animals. They are that intensely attached to them. It often affects senior citizens, older people, and so it's linked with issues affecting them as well. Dog fighting and cockfighting is a link issue. And as I said earlier, it can be linked with homicide, gambling, weapons offenses, narcotics, and sex trafficking. The school shooters and the mass shooters. I hope Portugal has not been faced with this like the United States has. I'm sure you're aware of these tragedies in the United States. And what we find is that about 10% of the school shooters or the mass shootings going on, about 10% of these offenders have histories of animal cruelty. And then we have animal sexual abuse. There are people who prefer to have sex with animals. There are places on the dark web linking linking animal pornography, and you can get animal pornography or crush videos. There are these videos of elegant women stomping little pets to death, and people get sexual gratification from seeing those videos. When we find these videos, we almost always find child pornography and other sex crimes as well. How did we get here? Back in the 1970s, we started getting the first research on this. And there was a theory at the time, you may recall reading this in a psychology book, it was called the McDonald Triad. And a psychologist found that the early childhood histories of many criminals included histories of arson, bedwetting, and animal abuse. That theory has kind of gone by the wayside now. It's been superseded by more sophisticated analysis of early childhood histories of criminals. In the 1980s, we started looking at serial killers and mass killers and found that, in fact, a significant number of them did have early childhood histories of animal cruelty. These names may not mean anything to you in Portugal. These are a rogues gallery in the United States of very serious serial killers. In the 1990s began the first wave of these terrific, horrendous school shootings that are unfortunately are still going on. And what we have found is that about 10% of these shooters have histories of animal abuse. It's a very significant and under-recognized risk factor. As we've got into the 21st century, we're looking at animal cruelty linked with a wide range of other crimes. Talk for a minute about the animal abuse and child abuse link. This is the oldest area of the link. Philosophers have been saying since St. Thomas Aquinas that children who hurt animals often grow up to become aggressive adults. In the 19th century, this idea really caught hold, and it's a major theme in Victorian literature. And the first societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals were formed and quickly began to protect children as well. In 1866, Henry Bergh, who was the American ambassador to Russia, was coming back to the US, and he stopped off in London, where he saw the world's first animal protection society, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and decided we needed something similar in the US. He formed the ASPCA. 8 years later, he was asked to intervene to rescue a girl named Little Mary Ellen from an abusive household. He got her out of the home. He established America's first child protection society. And for the next 80 years, many American animal protection agencies had a dual function of protecting both animals and children. That only began to change about 1962. This article appeared in the prestigious Journal of the American Medical Association, defining a new term called the battered child syndrome. This term had never been heard before. And it was written by physicians defining abused children as a medical condition that the medical profession had a responsibility to intervene and to protect these children. That is very similar to where we are today, with veterinarians now recognizing they have a responsibility to protect animals. And our argument here is that shouldn't the veterinarian be at least as proactive in protecting animals as physicians are in protecting children? As a result of this article in 1962, the US federal government created a national child protection system. We have a national agency, 50 state agencies, and 3,000 county agencies working in child protection. We do not have this in animal protection yet, and I will explain the American system here in a minute. The research between animal cruelty and child abuse is very strong. This was one study looking at families who had been investigated for child abuse and found that 60% of these families also had abused or neglected pets. And in these homes where it was physical child abuse, as opposed to emotional child abuse or sexual child abuse, if there was physical child abuse, the 88% of those families had abused animals. Two other things came out of this study that were very significant. There were 11 times more dog bites in these homes than in families that were not being investigated for child abuse. The animals picked up the violence that was going on around them and fought back with their teeth. And the study also found that these families being investigated for child abuse saw veterinarians at the same degree that non-abusive households did. And so when we do trainings for veterinarians, and we'll talk about this on Wednesday, when we do trainings for veterinarians that about the link, and they say, I'm never going to see an abused child, I'm never going to see an abused animal. It's not true. They will. Now let's talk about animal abuse and domestic violence. It's a very, very strong link. Many, many women and their children don't escape because they are afraid of what will happen to their pet. I recall one case. I was sitting at my desk and I got a phone call from a woman who was sitting in the parking lot of a domestic violence shelter 1,500 miles away. And they would not let her in the shelter because she had her dog with her. And she said, I've loved this dog longer than any relationship I've ever had. Well, I was able to locate for her a domestic violence shelter that accepted pets, and she was able to go and get both her and her dog to safety. As I said before, this is a type of emotional blackmail. The abusers hurt or threaten the pets to establish their sense of power and control over them, to retaliate against her for what he perceives to be an act of, violating what he wants her to do. He'll also harm the pets of her family or friends who help her escape. And it's a way to hold the entire family hostage in an abusive relationship. There are many reasons why women do not leave a domestic violence situation. They will blame themselves. They'll say, it was my fault. They will say, he didn't mean to hit me. They'll say, oh, it was just an accident. He's getting better. They apologize for what he did. What we need to be telling these women is that if he's hurting harmless animals, it's not your fault. It's not the cat's fault. It's his fault. And you and the children need to get out and make a safety plan that includes getting both you and the children and the pets to safety. A safety plan is a process that we have here in the US where domestic violence shelters train women to have everything they need to be able to leave at a moment's notice because they may not have much time to escape. So they can just flee at a moment's notice. We need to be including the pets in those safety plans. The statistics that we're finding in these domestic violence cases are staggering. One study of women in a domestic violence shelter found 71% of them reported their husband or boyfriend had killed, harmed, or threatened the animal. And almost 1/3 of these women said their children had hurt or killed animals. This is the intergenerational cycle of violence. Another study found 41% of people who had been arrested for intimate partner violence, domestic violence, had committed animal cruelty. More recent study looking at domestic violence suspects who also had histories of pet abuse, found that they're more violent. The victim said some pretty significant things. 80% of these women had had at least one prior domestic violence incident, and there were as many as 50 prior incidents before she worked up the courage to call for help. The violence, as I said earlier, is much more physical and hands-on. 76% of these women had been strangled. 26% had been forced to have sex with the man. 80% feared for their lives. And law enforcement officers always tell us that the cases they fear the most are domestic violence cases and there is a high risk of lethality for law enforcement officers investigating a domestic violence case. That risk of death to the first responders, to the police officers, the risk of death doubles when animal cruelty is also involved. This is not just an issue for cities. It also affects farming communities and rural areas. We saw this for the first time in 2006 in the state of Maine, in which a woman testified before the legislature in this state that it wasn't just the cats and the dogs that had been harmed. It was the sheep and the chickens. She was terrified for their welfare. She knew that if she left, he wouldn't hesitate to kill them. He had done it before. And the state of Maine quickly enacted the first law in the US, and I think the first law anywhere in the world, which specifically allows courts, when they issue a protection order, a protection from abuse order in a domestic violence case, to include the farm animals and the pets in that protection order. And today, 38 of our 50 states, 38 of our 50 states have those pet protection orders in place. When we talk about the elder abuse and animal abuse link, there's a lot to consider. People working with elders are often dealing with people with memory issues, reduced financial circumstances, lack of transportation, physical problems, health issues. They're often socially isolated. And these factors create situations that affect their animals as well. And there are a number of things that we see here. They may neglect the pet. They may love their animals, but because of those issues that they have, they can't afford the proper care. They can't afford the pet food. They can't afford the veterinary bills. And so the pets are neglected. Or we have many cases of self-neglect, where they'll take what limited money they have and spend it on their pets instead of their own health or their own food. They may be extremely attached to this pet. This pet may be the last link to a husband or wife who passed away. This pet may be the only reason for living, maybe the only reason she has to get up in the morning and have a sense of responsibility to feed the cat or the bird or the fish. It may be the only reason he has to get out of the house and go for a walk and get some exercise. And when the pet dies, the person can literally lose the will to live. We have safety issues for people working with elders, home health aides, or caseworkers from social service agencies, or homemaker services. They may not want to go into this house because it's filthy, because the owner has not been able to clean the cat litter box or get rid of the dog food cans in the sink, and the house is overrun with rats or cockroaches. We have cases where elders are subjected to financial exploitation, where their children will hold their pets hostage for ransom money. Disabled people who are extremely dependent on their service animals, their spouses or partners are often jealous about that dependency on the animal as opposed to caring for the human companion. And then the animal hoarding issue, which can affect any age group, but it tends to be more older people. So how does this play out in law enforcement and the courts? I have to explain how the American judicial system works to put it into a US context. And I frankly don't know how this compares with the Portuguese system. We are a nation of 50 states. And as I said, there are very few national laws affecting this. It's all done on the state level, and every state has its own set of laws. And within the state, we have counties, and there are over 3,100 counties in the United States. And most animal cruelty cases are handled by county prosecutors, and they each are elected officials dependent on public support, and they all have their own ideas as to what's an important crime to work with and which ones are not so significant. When somebody is charged with a crime in America, it may be a civil crime, and that only requires a preponderance of evidence to convict somebody. Or it may be a criminal charge, in which case it's a much higher threshold, and the jury has to find the person guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. When an offender is charged, there are several different levels of crime. It might be just a minor offense, in which case it's a small fine, or it could be a misdemeanor. They may be subjected to a fine and jail time. Or more serious charges are felonies. There's a much larger fine and going to prison. So all animal cruelty cases have to work within that system. How does animal protection system work in the US? You'll notice I have the word system and works in quotation marks because we do not have a system, and what we have doesn't necessarily work. We do not have a provedora do animal in the United States. There's no national ombudswoman protecting animals. There is no federal agency looking out for animals. There is no system. There's no coordinating agency. There's no national society for the prevention of cruelty to animals that has charge of the entire country. There are a few statewide agencies, but most of them have only limited powers. They don't have statewide powers. Enforcement is generally done on the local level. It's usually haphazard, and in many parts of the country, there are no designated agencies to handle animal protection. Many of the agencies that are involved with this do not have full training in law enforcement and in the legal procedures that law enforcement officers have to understand and work with. Animal protection may be handled by a municipal or a county animal control agency or an animal services agency. And those agencies can be under the police department, they can be under the health department, or any number of other municipal departments. Or it may be contracted out to an SPCA or a humane society. Or in the absence of any of those, it may be the local police department or the county sheriff. And for many of them, it isn't a priority. So that's how we try to deal with all this in the huge country of the United States. On top of all that, there is no standard definition of cruelty. There's no national law defining animal cruelty. Each state has their own definition. Some states don't, not every state has the same definition of what an animal is. The best definition of animal cruelty I've ever seen came from a British veterinary dictionary, which defined it as the infliction of pain or distress unnecessarily. And every state statute has some qualifier in there as to what's unnecessary and what's necessary. And that varies from time to time and culture to culture. And it's up to the courts to determine in any individual case whether something actually is an act of cruelty. And in fact, 95% of the reports that come into an agency are cases of neglect rather than physical abuse or sexual abuse of an animal. In the absence of a national definition or national statistics, because we don't even know how many animal cruelty cases there are because it's all done on a local level. We at the National Link Coalition helped the FBI back in 2016 to begin to collect data on the number of animal cruelty cases across the United States. And within this process, they came up with 4 types of animal cruelty. And it's a very simple way to define the various types of animal abuse, even though each state has its own laws. The most common cases are simple neglect of animals. But there's a subcategory of that, gross neglect, and that's animal hoarding. There's physical abuse of animals. Somebody who beats an animal, kicks it, stabs it, tortures it. Organized abuse is dog fighting or cockfighting. And then the 4th category is animal sexual abuse, which, as I said, is often linked with child pornography. It's important to note that each of these 5 types of animal cruelty comes from a different psychological profile. Each one is different. We can't really deal with the older, isolated woman with her 50 cats the same way we deal with a teenager who shoots a stray cat. They're all different. One size does not fit all. When we're talking about animal cruelty, it's an extremely emotional issue. And many people have their own perceptions of this. And the public often gets outraged about animal abuse. And this often causes confusion for legislators and law enforcement officers because there is so much emotion wrapped up in it. For the purposes of the link, we're not talking about the social issues that we have not achieved consensus as a society. So this is not about whether everybody should become a vegetarian and we should ban factory farming and mass animal production. We're not talking about whether we should ban biomedical experiments or ban fur coats. Those are issues that we haven't reached an agreement on, and we'll deal with those later. The link is talking about these individual acts of animal cruelty, abuse, and neglect. And people just need to understand the basics of what these involve. It's often a case of animal welfare, pets in poor physical condition with inadequate food, water, or shelter, a lack of veterinary care, animals that are dehydrated or starving, or have not been groomed, or infested with fleas and ticks and other parasites, or animals that have been abandoned. We see this often in times of recession. Physical injuries to animals, bruises, fractures, stab wounds, animals that are burned or strangled or shot, or somebody gets a puppy and they put a collar on the puppy, but they never change it as the dog grows up, and the collar will literally grow into an animal's neck. And you wonder, how could anybody be so stupid to do that? If you go to any large animal shelter in the United States, they will deal with 5 or 6 cases like that every year. Animal hoarding. The houses are absolutely filthy and overrun with insects, with feces that can be 5 or 6 inches thick, a smell of urine and ammonia that can be toxic. Dead animals are kept as well as living animals. The houses often have to be condemned and demolished. And then we have sexual abuse of animals, dog fighting, cockfighting, and situations where the safety and welfare of children is compromised. And we're asking child welfare workers to be on the lookout not only for abused animals, but dangerous animals that can threaten the child's health and safety. Why are adults cruel to animals? Well, There are as many reasons for animal cruelty as there are for interpersonal violence. In many cases, it stems from a lack of empathy. They feel entitled to hurt animals because they don't think the animals have feelings. Or they may come from a culture where abuse is normal. They're socialized to this, and they believe that violence and abuse are justified, and it's all about power and control. Or we're dealing with people who have poor coping skills. They are under a lot of pressure from other issues. They are sensitive to all these stressors, and the pet's behavior just takes them over the top, and they release their anger at the most convenient target. And that target could be a person or it could be an animal. They may harm an animal to threaten or control or intimidate somebody. And like I said, we see this in domestic violence and child sexual abuse. We also see it in neighborhood fights, where one neighbor is angry at another neighbor for something else, something unrelated. But they poison the neighbor's dog as a way to get back at the neighbor. They will use negative reinforcement, negative punishment to control the animal for a behavior problem without realizing that positive reinforcement works much better than negative reinforcement, as it does with trying to discipline a child. And then we have psychopaths. They're sadists. They feel that harming an animal enhances their own sense of aggression, or they even get sexual gratification for hurting animals. Why are children cruel to animals? All those same reasons, plus a few more. They may not know any better, or they will harm animals because they're bored, and they will videotape torturing animals and watch those videos later when they get depressed. We've had cases of children smothering their pets to protect them from worse abuse. We've had cases of children hurting animals to reenact their own abuse that they have experienced. It's a way for an abused child to regain a sense of power after they've been abused, where they may imitate what they see the adults in their lives doing. And the worst case scenario, it's a dress rehearsal for an act of interpersonal violence. Most people see their pets as members of the family. And we see this particularly in times of disaster, hurricanes, wildfires, floods, earthquakes. People will not go to safety. They will not get off the rooftop and get onto the helicopter unless they can take their pets with them. And we see this time and time again, because this bond that we have with our pets can be so incredibly strong. It's an international phenomenon. I was doing some lectures in Japan a few years after the tsunami and nuclear meltdown at Fukushima. The top two pictures here are very interesting. We cannot imagine the devastation these people went through, but they took their pets with them. And I love the two bottom pictures. The one on the right is a woman getting her dog tested for radiation with a Geiger counter. The one on the left is a woman in a refugee center feeding her dog grains of rice with chopsticks. This is how powerful the human-animal bond can be. Abusers will target the weakest link that they find. And in many domestic violence situations, the animals are soft targets, because we find pets are overwhelmingly in families with children. In the United States, I don't know what Portugal's numbers are, but in the United States, 2/3 of homes with children under age 6 and 3/4 of homes with children over age 6 have pets. And the primary caregiver is invariably the woman of the household. And it's because of those bonds, the abuser sees this as a weak link and targets the soft targets in the home. So even though emotionally we think of animals as companions and members of the family, and in fact, 99% of Americans think of their pets that way, and I suspect it's the same in Portugal. Only 1% of Americans think of their pets as property, but that is a tremendous disconnect because legally animals are property. They are in the same legal category as a toaster. But no abused woman ever ran back to her abuser to rescue her toaster. But they go back time and time again because they're afraid of what will happen to their animals. And the law has to treat them as property, even though the people treat them as members of the family. It creates this disconnect. Well, what is being done with all this information? As Laurentina mentioned, we have made tremendous progress, not only in the US, but other countries as well, by drawing attention to the fact that animal abuse not only hurts animals, it also hurts people. As a result of all this awareness of the link in recent years, all 50 of our states now have some form of animal cruelty that is considered a felony. As I mentioned earlier, a felony is the highest level of crime. Sex with animals is now illegal in 49 of our 50 states. So one state to go. But that's been a major advancement because we recognize sex with animals as its link with child abuse and child sexual abuse. In 22 of our states, having sex with animals puts the offender on the registered sex offender list. I don't know if Portugal has something similar to that. In 41 states, veterinarians now are either required to report suspected animal abuse or at least permitted to report animal abuse, usually with immunity from civil or criminal liability. And that's been a major step forward. And as I said earlier, we're trying to get veterinarians to be as proactive in responding to animal abuse as physicians have long been in responding to child abuse. 38 of our states now allow pets to be included in domestic violence protection orders. In 11 states, an act of animal abuse in this domestic violence situation is not only an act of animal cruelty, it's defined as an act of domestic violence. In 33 of our 50 states, we have cross-reporting programs. There's no consistent pattern here, but a variety of programs where veterinarians have to report animal abuse or child abuse, where animal control officers, animal protection officers report child abuse, where child protection people report animal abuse. And it's now a federal crime to go to a dog fight or to bring a minor to a dog fight or to let your land be used for a dog fight or to ship your animals for interstate transit for a dog fight. Major step forward for all of this. We now have, I believe, 56 prosecutors and law enforcement agencies around the country that have a specialized animal cruelty investigation and prosecution unit because there are so many cases and because the public is demanding action, because they're aware of the harm to the animals and the harm to people. We've developed a program of veterinary forensics, animal CSI, animal crime scene investigation, using the techniques that have long been used with forensic examinations in human crimes. We're adapting these in the veterinary field as well. When I got started in this field many, many years ago, we could take a picture of a thin dog like this and take it to a court and say the dog looks skinny. And that was all we had to work with. Later, they began to develop charts showing different degrees of malnutrition for an animal. It was based on what was being done with horses, and that got adapted for dogs. But then veterinary forensics began to develop, and textbooks were published with clinical information to help veterinarians distinguish non-accidental injury. And in our webinar on Wednesday, we will go into much more detail about that. The ASPCA, the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, has mobile crime scene laboratories that go around the country whenever there's a large animal cruelty case to investigate and come up with the clinical information that prosecutors can use to make a case more winnable. There is now an online course in veterinary forensics. I teach one of the classes. It's through the University of Florida. We have many students from all over the world. Love to see some Portuguese veterinarians taking this. There's an International Veterinary Forensic Sciences Association. So we're developing a network of veterinarians all around the world to create this material that enhances law enforcement and prosecutors' work in this area. We have developed what I call witness protection programs for pets, because so many women were showing up at domestic violence shelters that were not pet friendly, where they were not allowed in because they couldn't take the pets. We now have over 300 first we have about 600 women's shelters in the United States that will provide foster care for the animals with a local animal group in the community. And we have 300 domestic violence shelters that accept pets. These are coordinated by a program called Safety, Sheltering Animals and Families Together. Allie Phillips, who started this program, will be at our webinar on at the conference on June 2nd, and she'll be talking more about that program. We not only have 300 shelters in the US, but there are more in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and the Netherlands. And we hope maybe Portugal someday will begin to have pet-friendly shelters. We are getting victim services agencies and law enforcement agencies to begin to recognize this issue. This was a program from the city of Baltimore. The police department had come out and started its first victim services program. And they were about to publish these posters that showed a woman and a child huddling in the corner, the shadow of the abuser looming over them. And it was a poster designed to tell women that if they are in a domestic violence situation, they should call the police department. The woman who headed this program came to one of our trainings and realized she had forgotten something. And she went back to the drawing board, and through Photoshop, she put a dog in the poster. I mention this because once people start thinking about the animals in these issues, it's very easy to add them in. It is not an expensive process at all. What can you in law enforcement do? A lot. First, we encourage all law enforcement agencies to know what the laws are about animal cruelty, abuse, and neglect in their country, in their community. To be familiar with the most common signs of animal cruelty, abuse, and neglect. In doing any kind of an investigation, whether it's an animal cruelty case or something else, see if there are any animals involved. Are there any bonds between the people and the animals that need to be considered, or any animals whose welfare might be compromised? When investigating an animal cruelty case, look for possible domestic violence, child abuse, or elder abuse. And similarly, if you're investigating any of those other cases, see if there's possible animal cruelty involved. And that involves just asking a couple of basic questions. We recommend these 3 questions. Are there any pets or farm animals at the home? Has the person been concerned about their well-being? And has anyone in the family ever threatened, harmed, or killed an animal? If they say yes to any of those questions, that should be an immediate sign that there might be animal abuse involved, and more questions can be asked. Pay particular attention to signs of dogfighting or cockfighting. Dogfighting, we see situations like this where the dogs are chained on very heavy, very thick chains and kept in a way that they cannot get into contact with each other because they will kill each other. Fighting dogs have very stereotypical injuries. They may have scars on their faces and on their muzzles. Their ears may be missing because the owners have amputated their ears to give the other dogs one less thing to grab onto. They will build rings where the animals fight. And you'll see these in barns or sheds or out in the middle of the field somewhere or in basements. Training equipment. These dogs are highly conditioned athletes. They have treadmills. They have what we call a spring pole where the dogs hang for long periods of time to strengthen their jaw muscles and their neck muscles. The owners will get medications for their animals, steroids. They'll do their own first aid, vitamins. These are breaking sticks. Those are used to pry open the mouths of the dogs. Cockfighters, you may see scales that are used to weigh the birds, or what are called gaffs. These are these razor sharp blades that are attached to the talons of the birds when they fight. And that's all evidence that can be used in a court case. This is a publication that our National Prosecutors Agency, our National District Attorney's Agency published a few years ago, recommending some steps for law enforcement. They suggest treat an animal abuse case like an assault, not as a crime against property. And the FBI, as I mentioned earlier, considers it a crime against society. Veterinarians and animal protection agencies often don't know the legal procedures that law enforcement officers have to go through in order to prosecute a case. And so law enforcement and prosecuting agencies should train those people on what they need to do to be able to bring information to you so you can work with that case. As I said, we're gaining more and more veterinary forensic experts. I'd like to see a few more in Portugal. We'll be talking more about that on Wednesday's webinar. When there are a large number of animals involved, whether it's a hoarding situation or other forms of mass animal abuse, there's always an issue as to what to deal with the animal, how to deal with the animals, because there may be more animals there than any one agency can handle. And so decisions have to be made as to how to hold these animals as evidence until the case comes to court. Sometimes they are impounded and kept on the premises under supervision, or the owners may surrender the animals to the shelters. Many times the animals have to be euthanized, and veterinarians have to do necropsies to determine the state of abuse that occurred. Sometimes the owners have to pay a financial bond to pay for what can be enormous costs for caring for these animals. We also recommend talking to children about their pets. Children love to talk about their animals, and they will often give you tremendous insights into what's going on with the animals and other people in the home, where you can't get this information from talking to the adults in the home. Always be on the lookout for the link. And finding a case of animal cruelty or the presence of child abuse or domestic violence or elder abuse can be an important factor when it comes time to sentence this person, because there are multiple crimes involved. We're encouraging law enforcement agencies and prosecutors to set up these specialized animal cruelty units. Again, this may not necessarily be relevant in Portugal, where you have a federal agency dealing with this, but in the United States, where it's all done locally, we have to set up these local agencies. So in summary, animal abuse also hurts people. It's not just a crime against animals. It's not just an animal welfare issue. It is a crime against people and a crime against society. It's one of the 4 forms of family violence, and we need to think of it in those terms. If we recognize it and respond to it, it enforces the law and helps families and helps our communities. That's an introduction to all this. Again, please feel free to go to our link letter, to subscribe to our link letter, go to our website. Feel free to email me. I will be in Lisbon on June 2nd for the conference, and I'll be doing 2 more webinars this week. And love to talk to you and find out more about how we can help you. So I think we have some time here for some questions. So let me turn this over to Laurentina or the translator here, and if anybody has some questions, I'll see if I can take them.
Vamos questionar se alguém gostaria de ter uma questão. O Major Cláudio Sarabia, o Subintendente David Pereira gostariam de, em nome dos seus representantes, colocar algo mais uma vez, trazendo aquilo que disse no início. Este é um momento de sensibilização. Aquilo que nós queremos realmente, temos os sistemas que são americanos, eles o Phil diz que lá é tudo para tenhamos as nossas entidades nacionais, também há muitas instituições locais e, portanto, sintam diferentes os clientes. Aqui o principal deste webinar, que é um webinar de antevisão, uma conferência, é dar realmente importância aos nossos colaboradores que hoje estão aqui e co-organizadoras, que são as forças policiais, não é? As forças militares, portanto, da GNR e a polícia PSP. Portanto, distinguir o vosso trabalho como extremamente importante neste tema de link, e aquilo que nós queremos que hoje as pessoas que nos estiveram a ouvir saiam daqui com a ideia é realmente isso, link em inglês, a ligação, que as violências estão ligadas e nós temos que começar a olhar para a crueldade contra os animais, não como algo ligeiro, mas algo que pode denunciar outra crueldade na família, ou que pode denunciar alguma coisa que possa vir a acontecer, porque realmente nós devemos considerar, tal como os animais também considerados como propriedade e objeto, não é? Vemos hoje em dia, não tem figura própria na Constituição, não é? Figura jurídica, e portanto não conseguimos criminalizar. Por isso, de alguma forma, o que temos aqui que passar é que é inaceitável que estas situações que nós vemos, sofrimento animal e sofrimento humano, não sejam considerados crime. E de que, de alguma forma, nós sabemos que estas 4 áreas que se tocam dos seres vulneráveis. As crianças são vulneráveis, as mulheres também são vulneráveis, os idosos são vulneráveis e os animais são vulneráveis. Estas 4 bolas que o Phil ali colocou, em que forças policiais tocam em todas estas áreas, convivem com aquilo que se passa na casa das pessoas, na agressão com as pessoas, nos problemas em que são chamados a resolver com as pessoas e, obviamente, na parte dos animais, e muitas vezes somos chamados para tratar de um assunto que vai levantar a consideração sobre outros. É esta a mensagem que nós queremos aqui começar a pensar e a passar, de que devemos estar na crueldade e nos maus tratos com os animais como uma atenção específica àquilo que se passa com o ser humano e estarmos numa sociedade que não admite realmente que seres indefesos possam ser tratados com tal crueldade e com tais situações que nós hoje ouvimos aqui falar e que você no terreno vê muito e vê mais. E na parte seguinte, depois nós fazemos aqui um intervalo mais ao filo, a próxima meia hora será uma colega portuguesa que vai aqui falar de alguns exemplos de situações graves de morte de animais e de resultados de necrópsia e ligação à violência com as pessoas que nós sabemos que existe, obviamente, no nosso país. Mas eu agora, não sei, o Phil, se há alguma pergunta para o Phil e alguma consideração também aqui dos nossos 2 grandes motivadores desta ação, Sr. Major, Sr. Subintendente, se querem fazer uma consideração, uma questão ao Phil.
Bem, da parte da Polícia de Segurança Pública, algo importante que me parece de relevar é que não só é importante a atuação das nossas brigadas de proteção ambiental, como também será muito importante, mesmo para os animais, a atuação do nosso policiamento de proximidade, seja na questão das crianças, na escola segura, seja também na parte dos idosos. E daqui, apesar disso de chamar de link para uma questão específica, temos que fazer também a ligação interna, ou seja, internamente, também a parte dos programas de proximidade terão que fazer uma ligação com a parte da defesa animal e com as BRIPA. Isso parece-me evidente aqui desta exposição. Isso será algo que poderemos desenvolver e será certamente algo que podemos aqui melhorar aqui a nível interno, até para que umas situações levem a outras e possamos acudir à maior parte das situações mais graves. E da minha parte para já é tudo.
É mesmo isso, é mesmo esta sensibilização que nós queremos começar a pensar como é que vamos todos em conjunto, não é? Fora da nossa área, do nosso serviço e dentro do nosso fazer. É isso, exatamente. Muito obrigada, Sr. Superintendente, concordo perfeitamente. A mensagem passada. Major Cláudio.
Cumpro-me agradecer ao Sr. Phil pela sua brilhante apresentação. Mais importante, certamente, do que os meus comentários é eventuais questões que possam surgir na audiência e concordo também com o subintendente naquilo que diz respeito à ligação interna das várias capacidades das forças de segurança, seja no âmbito da prevenção criminal e do policiamento comunitário, seja na prevenção do crime de violência doméstica, como também naquilo que é a atuação das forças que têm competência nesta área da proteção animal, naquilo que é a sua ligação com a violência sobre os animais, ou os crimes maus tratos a animais, seja eles de companhia ou não, com o crime de violência doméstica. Mas eu, se me permite complementar aquilo que o Sr. Subintendente referiu, há também a relevância daquilo que é a ligação com as entidades externas. Por se internamente, como forças de segurança, temos, de acordo com a nossa organização e hierarquia, aquilo que é a ligação entre as várias capacidades das forças de segurança. Estamos a falar do policiamento comunitário, da investigação criminal através da investigação e apoio a vítimas específicas, seja através da área do ambiente, e principalmente aquilo que diz tudo, que é o patrulhamento diário que é efetuado pelo nosso dispositivo territorial. Não menos importante, ressalvava a ligação com as autoridades judiciárias, os médicos veterinários municipais, a Direção-Geral de Alimentação e Veterinária e as associações zoófilas, como também as universidades, em que muitas das vezes temos que nos socorrer a estas duas últimas para que possam, através de alguns protocolos existentes, fazerem as necrópsias, fazerem a recolha e fazerem também aquilo que é os cuidados veterinários, muitas das vezes os mais urgentes, em que em alguns distritos não existe as urgências veterinárias suficientes para acudir quando nós sinalizamos, ou então não são apresentadas dar nota que cerca de 22% das denúncias da nossa linha SOS Ambiente e Território são referentes a animais de companhia, e daí, só para complementar, a importância não só da ligação interna em cada uma das forças de serviço de segurança, como as ligações externas se têm de estabelecer localmente junto destas entidades. Portanto, este é o comentário que me apraz referir neste momento. Eventualmente, se do auditório da Guarda Nacional Republicana houver alguma questão que queiram colocar, se não, novamente, os parabéns ao professor Phil pela sua brilhante apresentação. Obrigado.
Muito bem, muito obrigada. Então, alguma questão que queiram colocar antes de fazermos o intervalo e ouvirmos o que o Sr. Major disse muito bem, o recurso muitas das vezes às universidades e a outras entidades, nomeadamente na ajuda para a prova do crime. Vamos fazer um intervalo, seguir a uma ou duas questões, se houver, e depois agradecia que voltássemos, está bem, para ouvir a professora Isabel Pires na sua intervenção em português, dar alguns casos da experiência dela de situações graves com animais. Portanto, alguma questão da audiência, o colega Xavier pode estar atento a essa possibilidade, se alguém levanta a mão, onde estou não consigo aperceber-me.
Nenhuma questão ainda.
Eu acho que, como nós estávamos a dizer, isto é para nos deixar a pensar, não é verdade? Isto é para nos deixar a pensar. Como trabalhar melhor, como fazer melhor, e realmente adquirir aqui uma nova consciência sobre a importância de nós olharmos para os maus-tratos animais como algo muito sério e não como, às vezes, ligeiro, e tendemos a que não faz mal, só está a bater no cão. Temos que pensar de outra forma. Muito bem, então, se não temos questões, eu propunha que fizéssemos um intervalo, já passam das 10 para as 4, eu diria voltarmos, não sei, Sr. Major, quanto tempo de intervalo? 10, 15 minutos, 15 minutos para um café? 15 minutos?
Já deixava essa resposta para a próxima hora agora, da nossa parte, entre 10 e 15 minutos, achamos
Doutora
razoável.
Isabel, dá 15 minutos para